Let's open to the Gospel by Mark, chapter 11. You know, what's amazing is 9 years ago, it was the biggest storm. Isn't the weather unusual in Oklahoma? I mean, it was a tremendous blizzard and ice storm, and now it's hot. It's interesting. Okay, what we're going to do this evening is look at Jesus last night. I mentioned this morning, there is a heightened awareness about the death of Christ and His burial and His suffering, more so than I've seen in my whole lifetime. And I think that it's an opportune time to be a light, to give the gospel. When people, you know, like the pizza man on Monday, when they give you the slow pitch, step forward, step into it. You remember your coach used to say that? Step into it, you know, to hit it harder. Step into it. You know, our track racks aren't out yet, but get some. I mean, I gave away all the tracks I had this last couple days traveling. People really are listening. And also be prepared. The reason I decided to do this evening is my daughter, who's over at TCC taking classes, said in one of her classes, someone said, now, was Jesus on the cross 3 days? I mean, there is basic biblical ignorance out there. I mean, they said, isn't 3 days, what was it, 3 days on the cross? Was it 3 days in the prison? Was he in the... She said he was in the grave. Oh, yeah, that part. Okay, in the grave 3 days. And see, people, they don't even know that we have a whole generation that haven't gone to Sunday school, that haven't gone to church, that haven't listened. And you know, if you even know something about the Bible, they just ask questions. And so let's just review it together, starting in chapter 11. And I'm going to real quickly go with you through Jesus last night. From Galicantu, that means the cock crow. We've been covering that. That's where Peter denied Christ. To Golgotha, which is the hill that, let's see, is this going to work? Where do I point it? There. Oh, Palm Sunday. That's where we are. Palm Sunday. Am I working it or you're working it? I'm working it. Okay. If I get mixed up, you keep it going. Palm Sunday, chapter 11, verses 1 through 10, just for you to know. And we're soon going to be looking forward to our whole celebration. It's just a month away of that. And just, you know, the whole time of Christ's passion, His death and burial. But the triumphal entry, which we call Palm Sunday, in through the gate there, Jesus entered the sheep gate. I'll show that to you right there. Jesus came in the sheep gate. There are, if you read the book of Nehemiah, they built the gates and the city, and we basically follow the same route. This top thing, I can't turn in all directions, but this is the temple precinct. This is the Antonian fortress, and right behind the Antonian fortress, right there, is where all of the lambs were coming in. And we've studied this in depth, but this little road is the Sheep Gate Road right there. And it goes to the pool of Bethesda. Remember the incredible moment of the man in John 5 who was laying there totally unable to move, and Jesus healed him at the pools of Bethesda. In fact, the famous song, He Touched Me, you know, that whole idea that Jesus reached down and touched him. But Jesus would have walked in on Palm Sunday down this road right there and went right by where they were washing. They used to bring in the you know, sheep are the dirtiest animal. And of all the barnyard animals, sheep are much dirtier than pigs. Pigs like dirt, but don't really get dirty because of the way that they're built. But sheep are like a walking, you know, sponge. And so they would have to wash them off on these pools. And so Jesus walked by there as He presented Himself as the Lamb of God. This is, you can't read it, but I just put that in. That's my notes. And that's basically the Gospel of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. And of the Thursday, which is where we're going to start tonight, the Thursday of Christ's final week, and you can see that they prepared the Passover meal, they had the Last Supper. Then Jesus washes the feet. That's only over here in chapter 13 of John's Gospel. Then He points out the betrayer. That's in all four Gospels. The apostles are warned against their desertion. And then the Last Supper. This is where we get communion from, right across there. By the way, communion is not at all in John's Gospel. Very interesting. The Gospel that says, eat my body, drink my blood, never has communion in it, because the Lord didn't want to have the modern problem we have of the Mass. I believe that's why it's missing. And then Jesus rebukes them, and then the farewell to the apostles in the upper room. And that's where we pick up tonight. They go to this place. This is modern day Gethsemane. This is a 2,000-year-old olive tree there. Olive trees don't ever die. They just keep growing out, further out. And from the shoots that come out the bottom, you can see one right there. That little thing right there at the bottom is a netzer, where we get the Nazarene, the shoot. Jesus is a shoot out of the stump of Israel, and he is the branch, the promised one. So Passover Thursday night, Jesus goes there. You remember we covered this in depth, all the events of that last night. Jesus, if you want to turn over to chapter 14 of the Gospel by Mark, and where we're going to start really heavily reading is in chapter 15, but 14:26 and 32 to 42 goes through the events, and let me briefly chronicle them for you. He goes to the place that they knew of, which it's still there. This is called the grotto, or the cave of Gethsemane. This is where Gath Shemayim. This is where olives were pressed. And it's still there. If you ever have an olive grove, you have to harvest them and do something with them. And most people didn't pickle them and put a pimento in them back then. They squashed them, and they squashed them 3 times, 3 different levels of weights. And the first was the first pressing, which was the best, and then it got coarser and worse. And this is where they did that. And this was a public place. This olive press was a public, kind of like our public parks. So you would go to the public press, and you would press your stuff, and it took hours to press, so you would sleep on the floor to guard your olive pressings, your oil. And when it wasn't olive season, which it wasn't olive season at the time of Passover, it was just kind of like a free place to sleep if you were poor. And Christ was poor. He didn't have a place to lay his head. So this spot is most likely where Jesus would stay when he was in Jerusalem. This is what it looks like today. You can't see it very well, but that is inside. If you were actually inside this cave that's down here, this is a page from the Biblical Archaeological Review magazine, Bar it's called. And this is where they're, in a recent issue, we're saying that archaeologically, after they've excavated all those side rooms, they said this is a 1st century structure. This cave was actually in use, and this is what was in it. This is an olive press, and you see the olives are in these little baskets, and these are the 3 weights. And they would first put on 1 weight, and that would be the first crushing. That was the purest oil. That was the best. That's what you use for cooking and what you use for medicinal purposes, just special stuff. The second pressing was what you use for other, your lamps and stuff like that. And the final pressing is if you made soap, it's just the coarser stuff. But you can see they would put the olives in there after they had first crushed them. And you remember Gethsemane speaks to us of Isaiah 53, of our sins crushing Christ. And so he was in the place where olives were crushed, and he was sweating great drops of blood. This is a modern day olive press. You can't see very well, but they're still doing it today that way through the Middle Ages. This beam that is used there is the Gath Shemanim, which is where we get the English word Gethsemane, which means a place of pressing. So Jesus went to the place of pressing and got pressed for our sins. He bore the weight of sins, and this is some of the hardware that they have to show that. You can see the crown of thorns here, and this is the stone that they say he knelt on. It probably isn't. And some of the pictures. But this shows the whole process. So that's where he was that night. And the next event was he was out by these trees throwing himself on the ground. And while Jesus was laying there, it says just groaning and crying out. It says he was making loud crying and screaming in not only here in Mark, but in John. But Hebrews brings it out, chapter 5. He was being crushed by my sins. And I mentioned it this morning. The early Christians were so aware. They didn't speak of this in the general sense. They spoke of it in the personal sense. Paul says, he gave himself for me. That was their confession. Paul's personal salvation confession is, He bore my sins in His own body on the tree. On the tree. By the way, that's how those who saw Him crucified, they had not seen the movie. And so they saw the real thing, and they said Jesus in the Bible was crucified on a tree, not on a European cross that is in all the movies. But that's all right. It doesn't matter about that. But now the next thing that's in my notes is now we're getting to the after midnight events. They came and got Him. We've already looked at this in depth, and the whole drama of Jesus being taken off, and He was taken to this place. This is the modern day church right there. You've seen it several times. This beautiful modern structure built over the place of Caiaphas. And that takes us to our next passage, verse 43. And this is Jesus being arrested. From there through 15:1, where we're actually going to start tonight. In rapid succession, we go from Caiaphas' house, which is underneath that huge structure with the cross on the top. That structure is built over the top of Caiaphas' house. We go there. Here's the drawing showing Jesus being dragged, just shamefully, brutally treated. He was taken. This is what it looked like in the time of Christ. Right there, this central structure with a courtyard. Annas and Caiaphas, two servant. One was the previous serving high priest who served for many years, and then was the currently serving high priest with a courtyard. We remember over the weeks we've looked at this. This is where, actually this is a real thing. The Jews say it. This is Caiaphas that presided over Christ's crucifixion. That man, when he died, was buried in that box, and his body, his bones were still in there when they found it 10 years ago. You remember I told you the monument where Peter, the cock is crowing up there in the top, and Peter is denying the soldiers looking on, and you remember that. We looked at that. This is remember the little hole that they put him down through into the prison underneath. And that's where we pick up right there in chapter 15. So I'm going to start there tonight and showing you some elements of Pilate's life. You follow along in your Bibles, and starting in verse 1. Immediately, Mark 15:1, in the morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus, led him away, and delivered him to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered and said to him, "It is as you say." And the chief priests accused him of many things, but he answered nothing. Then Pilate asked him again, saying, "Do you answer nothing? See how many things they testify against you." But Jesus still answered nothing, so that Pilate marveled. Now, the event that we're seeing is Jesus had been brought. You can, just the red line on the far right, and I think I'm running out of battery, but let me get over there. Right there is the Last Supper. They walked to Gethsemane. Jesus was dragged back to right there, which is the home of Caiaphas. Now, he's taken in the morning around the huge palace of Herod, who is now dead and has been taken over by the Romans, and he's taken to Pilate's palace. Pilate was staying in the largest structure outside of the temple in the city. And that structure today is still there. This is it today. You can still see this tower. You can still see this citadel right here. And this area is just a wide open space. But right now, this rebuilt, this is actually the model that's built in the Holy Land Hotel. And this is from another angle looking back. This is what you see today. This is the modern day Jaffa Gate. This is the citadel of David, it's called. David had nothing to do with it. And this large part is where Pilate lived. This is now just an open field, but this was one of the largest palaces of the ancient world. And so early in the morning, the first 5 verses say that they dragged him over at the crack of dawn to this place. Now, later on, he's going to be dragged off to the Praetorian Hall, which is way over by the temple. I want to just pause to think about Pilate with you, because Jesus did something with Pilate he didn't do with anyone else. He talked to him. he actually shared with him. And I just want you to stop and think about that, because for a brief moment, Pontius Pilate faced the ultimate question that anybody could be confronted with. And I want to show you. Leave for a second, Mark, and turn back to Matthew 27. We'll come right back here, so don't lose your place. But turn back one book to Matthew chapter 27. And we're going to look at verse 22 for just a second. This is what Matthew records. Matthew 27:22. Pilate said to them, this is in this whole, they're dragging him around, and they've already evilly treated him, and he was down in that dungeon hanging, and all the stuff that was going on. Pilate said to them, "What then shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ?" That is a tremendous question. That's the same question that everybody's faced with. What will you do with Jesus? Neutral you cannot be. You see, Pilate was confronted with Christ, and it was an overwhelming moment that the only person Jesus chose to speak to on his way to the crucifixion, Pilate got it all. Pilate had quite an extensive dialogue with him. Jesus answered under oath once to the chief priests. He wouldn't talk to Herod Antipas at all. He wouldn't talk to the priests and the scribes and the Sadducees and the Pharisees at all, other than when they put him under oath. And if he would not have answered, he would have been lying. And since he's truth, he answered. That's all. But he didn't talk to him. But he did talk to Pilate. And I just want to go through Pilate's talk, because Pilate had a problem. He was torn between two choices. He had two roads. He had two options. He could go the way of the rabble and the crowd and the evil speakers, or he could respond to this man that spoke like no one ever spoke, that he knew was innocent. Pilate was the highest authority of the land. And Pilate repeatedly said he was innocent. Repeatedly. That's why Jesus' crucifixion was unjust and murderous, because he was declared 7 times, we saw that last time, 7 times declared to be righteous and innocent. And they still crucified him. There was a song written in 1905 by a guy named Albert Simpson about this moment, verse 22 of chapter 27. And it's an old golden oldie. I remember singing this growing up. It was always in the hymn books. And I'll read it to you. Jesus is standing in Pilate's hall, friendless, forsaken, betrayed by all. Hearken what meaneth the sudden call. What will you do with Jesus? See verse 22? It's this same idea that when he was asked, what then shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ? Pilate's asking the crowd. Actually, he's asking himself. And that's what this hymn writer, the refrain is, what will you do with Jesus? Neutral you cannot be. Someday your heart will be asking, what will he do with me? Just a moving song. Next stanza, Jesus is standing on trial still. You can be false to him if you will. You can be faithful through good or ill. What will you do with Jesus? Will you evade him as Pilate tried? Or will you choose him, whate'er betide? Vainly you struggle from him to hide. What will you do with Jesus? Will you, like Peter, your Lord deny? Or will you scorn from his foes to fly? Darling, Jesus, to live or die, what will you do with Jesus? Jesus, I give you my heart today. Jesus, I'll follow you all the way. Gladly obeying thee, what will you say? This I will do with Jesus. And then the refrain, what will you do with Jesus? Neutral you cannot be. Someday your heart will be asking, what will he do with me if you make the wrong choice? Well, back to Mark 15, verse 1. Let's pick up where Pilate was, because Pilate had to make some choices. And his choices aren't good. Immediately in the morning, it says, the chief priests held a consultation with him, verse 1 says, and the elders and scribes, and they bound Jesus, they led him, delivered him to Pilate. And we're picking up, actually, this is the 3rd trial of Christ. He's already been tried previous to this. The first one is the one before Annas, the ex-high priest. Remember the 2 sides of the big courtyard there. That's in John 18. We looked at that last time. He is in the middle of the night charged with being irreverent, and that didn't fly. Then in Mark 14:53, if you look back, that's trial number 2 of these trials that Jesus had. And this is before Caiaphas. It's centered on Christ blaspheming, and they said his blasphemy was he called himself the Son of God. Now in verse 1 of chapter 15, this is before the entire Sanhedrin. Basically, Jesus' trials, there were 3 with the Jews, and there were 3 with the Romans, and Romans overseeing them. And so now we're at the final Jewish one. It's the whole Sanhedrin. And that ends in verse 1, and they pass him off to Pilate. That's at the ending of verse 1. And so Pilate has the hot potato. And it's interesting if you notice, if you spend time putting all the text together, Pilate tries to get rid of Jesus. I mean, it's just like a pass. He gets it and he passes it right back. It's like someone doesn't want to shoot. They get the ball and they pass it right away. They don't want to shoot. And they can't hold on to it. And Pilate didn't want to shoot. He didn't want to get in trouble. And just to give you a little background on Pilate, he is quite a figure in history. We know a lot about him because he was an official of the Roman Empire. He served for 10 years. This was only his 4th year in office. He had 6 more when this happened with Jesus. So he's there from 26 to 36. He was the Roman officer in charge of all of Judea. During the time of his 10 years, he had the most unforgettable moment of his whole reign. Jesus coming before him. Basically, Pilate has the distinction of being the only person Jesus chose to talk with. I think that Jesus was reaching out to him. And Pilate, he missed his opportunity. He's the classic illustration of someone Jesus reached out to. Jesus refused to answer the King Herod Antipas. He only answered under oath to Caiaphas, but Pilate alone seems to be singled out. And in fact, if you turn to the right, to the Gospel by John, chapter 18, let me show you what I mean. John's Gospel, chapter 18. This is what I mean. Unusually, Jesus explained his unique purpose for being here. In John 18, and look at verse 36. Jesus is declaring to a pagan Roman ruler his deity. This is what he says in verse 36. Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." And Pilate said to him, "Are you a king then?" I mean, he's getting all mixed up. And Jesus answered, "You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I've come into the world, that I should bear witness of the truth, and everyone who's of the truth hears my voice." And you remember the interchange there. Interesting. Did Jesus ever serve as king of the Jews? Was he ever the king of the Jews? No. He was promised to be. We just went through the Christmas season, right? And his name shall be called Jesus. And his name is the Son of David. And he is the King of the Jews. He's going to sit, the angel said, on the throne of his father David, right? We sing that, right? Did he ever do it? No. That's what, if you wonder how you answer an Arab question or wondering why, the Israelis, that's what that stewardess was asking me on Friday. She said, I thought, she said, all the Jews became Christians and God's done with the Jews. That's Catholic doctrine. I said, no, think with me about Christmas. Jesus here at Christmas and here says, yes, I am the King of the Jews. When has he ever been the King of the Jews? Never. He's yet to be. In the future, they're going to see him, recognize him, mourn, and allow him to be their king at the end. It was so interesting when I showed Amal, the Syrian Orthodox from Damascus, when she saw that in the scriptures in Zechariah 12 through 14, it was so interesting. She just said, okay, it actually says it. Now tell me how to have a, personal relationship with him. Well, don't you wish Pilate would have done that, but he didn't. It was Pilate who uttered those immortal words. Look at chapter 19 of John's Gospel, just down a few verses. Chapter 19, verse 12. Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, if you let this man go, then you're not Caesar's friend. Whoever is, Jesus goes with him won't be Caesar's friend. But look what Pilate says in verse 14. It was a preparation day, and he said to the Jews, behold your king. And they cried out and say, away with him, crucify him. And Pilate said, shall I crucify your king? And the chief priests, look at that, we have no king but Caesar. Fulfilling what Daniel said. Remember a few weeks ago we looked at Daniel 9, the greatest prophecy in the Bible, the greatest eschatological prophetic passage, where it said that the servants of the king would come and sweep through and destroy Jerusalem, and they did, like we said. Perhaps it's for this reason, look at verse 19 of John 19, perhaps for this reason that Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross. And the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And when we get later to the crucifixion scene, I'll show you the Hebrew words of that titulus or titulus that was above his head. And in Jewish people, they have two ways of thinking. They have code. The Jewish people always think of the first letters of words, and they make a lot of sequential numeric. In fact, that some of the greatest code writers and breakers are Jewish people, because they believe in all their life they've used the Hebrew language for coding. And they call it atbash, and there are different ways they can do it, and they take the first letter of each word. To a Jewish person looking up at the cross, they saw the sacred name of God, because if you look at these words, Jesus, Nazareth, the King of the Jews, it exactly in Hebrew spells Jehovah. And they saw it just like that, and I'll show it to you in a couple of weeks, and you'll see why they said, take that sign down, verse 20. Don't have it. And the chief priest, verse 21, said, don't write it that way. The order you write it is terrible. And Pilate says in verse 22, what I have written, I have written. And he refused to change it. Well, it's interesting. In 1961, 43 years ago, they were excavating on the coast of Israel this whole area we call Caesarea Maritima. And in 1961, they were carrying out buckets of stuff, and they came across a 4-foot long, 2-foot high piece of stone. And they dusted it off, and it had Pontius Pilate, Procurator, Judea. And it showed his dates and his name and everything. And it was an official dedication when he dedicated the temple actually to Tiberius Caesar. When he erected and dedicated that Tiberium, it was called, he in Latin had written in stone, Pontius Pilate, Prefect or Procurator of Judea. And it's the exact title that's in Luke 3:1. And so it shows to the archaeologists, it was the first attestation that there really was a Pilate in the Holy Land, like the Bible said. And of course, that was in 61. They found a lot more. Well, let's go back to Mark 15, and let's stay in Mark 15 until we get Pilate done. There are 3 things I want you to see about Pilate before we go tonight. Verse 1, Pilate was living for the wrong goals in life, and that's going to be clear. Then verses 2 to 5 of Mark 15, Pilate was wasting his last chance, and he didn't even know it. Jesus was reaching out to him. And can you imagine if Pilate would have talked and responded what he could have learned? But he didn't. And we'll see Paul comments on that. And then the end of, from verse 6 down to 21, we see the reason is that Pilate was listening to the wrong crowd. Verse 1 of Mark 15, let me just give you a little background about Pilate from history. Pilate had a lot of pluses in his life. First thing is he married right. Did you know Roman governors were not allowed to bring their wives? Nobody. They only serve a year at a time. And they were not allowed to take their wife. They left for a 1 year, kind of like a tour of duty, sent out directly from Rome to govern the provinces, keep them peaceful, collect the taxes. But Pilate was allowed to take his wife. How do we know? She's in the text. And that's why people said the Bible's inaccurate. Roman governors were never allowed to take their wives. He was. Do you know why? His wife was the daughter of the emperor. Tiberius's daughter. Pilate married. I mean, this guy started out right. Her name was Claudia Procula. She was no less than the daughter of the Emperor Tiberius, though an illegitimate one, but the emperors had many mistresses and consorts, and she was a known daughter of the emperor. She was the granddaughter of Augustus. I mean, this woman was known in the courts and the palaces of Rome, and Pilate married into the family. So he had a big plus. He had it from the beginning. And the emperors, throughout the life of Christ, were tied to this man Pilate. So Pilate was riding the imperial glow of Rome, hopefully to the top. He married well. He chose powerful friends. He took a big post. He had extra benefits by being in this province of Judea. And no one else was allowed to take their wife, and he did, because she was so famous. So, I mean, this guy had everything going for him in 26 AD when he came here. The second big plus for him was that because of being married to this Claudia Procula, her family was very close to the man who was to become the next emperor, the successor to Tiberius. His name, if you know anything about history, his name was Sejanus. He was a tribune of Rome. He rose like a rocket into the heavens. He had gone to the top of the palace of the emperor. And the summer before the crucifixion, when Tiberius was weak and tired, by the way, Tiberius was 75 years old at the crucifixion of Christ. The emperor was that old. At 75, he left this friend of Pilate, Sejanus, in control, left for the palace that the emperors followed or would go to in the summer on the Isle of Capri, and basically left Sejanus, this man, this tribune, in charge of the whole Roman Empire. And one of his best friends, Sejanus' friends, was Pontius Pilate. So, I mean, I'm sure he would just stay awake at night, couldn't sleep, thinking of what would be next, after this post in Judea, what would he get next, Would he have a bigger province, or would he be the vice emperor? And so, in the 75th year of Tiberius, he named from Capri Sejanus as his partner in the work, and left the running of the Roman Empire in the hands of this man. The third big plus, first one, he married right. Pilate married Tiberius' daughter. Second is he picked the right friends. He became best friends with this soon to be the emperor. The third thing he did was he had a shared interest with Sejanus. They hated the Jews and wanted to exterminate them. Pilate actually ordered the butchering. Remember Jesus said, whose blood Pilate mingled with the sacrifices? He sent in the legionnaires, and they just eviscerated, the Jews at one time. And so it was a shared hatred. And so a group began called the Friends of Caesar. Now, what did they say to him? He says in the text that we read, they said, if you say this, you will not be a friend of Caesar. Remember we were reading back in John? That wasn't just a light statement by the priests. They knew the tie of Pilate through his wife's friend Sejanus, that this group of Roman governors had allied themselves with this up-and-coming emperor named Sejanus, and they had formed a club called the Friends of Caesar's Club. And so those priests knew that he had hitched his wagon to that star. And so the mutual hatred for the Jews, the extermination, the goal of the Friends of Caesar had started, and the Jews were expelled from Rome, and Pilate was working from his end, trying to make things hard for the Jews. However, something went wrong. And what went wrong was, after that summer on Capri, with the summer before the crucifixion, it was told to Caesar Tiberius that Sejanus was not waiting for him to die. He was going to overthrow the aged Tiberius. And if you read any history books, one of the most convulsive moments of the Roman Empire in the life of Christ was when Tiberius went back to Rome, took the reins of power, and executed the successor, Sejanus, the friend of Pilate, the friend of Pilate's wife. And that happened in the late winter before the Passover, the crucifixion. So Pilate, formerly called the friend of Caesar through Sejanus, was now a suspect by the emperor. And the chief priests knew the politics of the day, and they were saying, you're going to lose your governorship. You probably will be executed like Sejanus. If you don't go along with us, we're going to say that you were supporting another usurper. Sejanus was trying to get the throne of the emperor. This Jesus is trying to get the throne of the province. So that's the background. So Pilate was fearful for his life. He worried the Jews were going to accuse him before Tiberius. And his tragic plight was one who had taken all the wrong... He had banked all of his chips, as it were. He pushed him across the table and put him in the square of this tribune, Sejanus, and he bet everything on one roll of the dice that Sejanus was going to win, that he was going to be the next emperor, and Pilate was going to follow his coattails. And that man was wiped out. Now, for just a second, this reminds me so much. If you go to the next book, go to Luke chapter 12, because I want to show you, most of us will never be a Pilate at all. We'll never, have Jesus in front of us and all that. But a lot of us are going to have to make choices in life where we put our chips, as it were, of life. Look at chapter 12. Jesus talked a lot about this idea. There are lives that Jesus profiles in the Scriptures, especially this one in Luke 12, verse 13, who also was banking all of his life on one thing. Pilate banked everything on being a friend of Caesar. Now look in Luke 12. Remember Jesus' story, verse 13? One from the crowd said, hey, divide the inheritance with me. And Jesus said to him, who made me a judge and arbitrator? And he said, beware and take heed of covetousness. Your life does not consist in the abundance of the things that you possess. Pilate measured his life by what he hoped for. He wanted to possess power. He wanted to possess position. He wanted to possess a political hope of rising up into the very echelons, the highest reaches of the palaces of Rome. And he bet everything on it. Look at this guy. This is more close to us. This guy says, I know what I want. Look at verse 16. He spoke a parable to them, saying, the ground of this rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no room to store all my crops? So he said, I know what I'll do. I'll pull down my barns, I'll build greater, and there I'll store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease. Eat, drink, and be merry. And then look at verse 20. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul will be required of you. And then whose things will these be which you have provided? And Jesus said this, so is he who lays up treasures for himself and neglects being rich toward God. He left God out of his equation. Now most of us will never have to make a choice between Jesus and the chief priest, Jesus and Pilate, and the emperor Tiberius and Sejanus. But we will have to make a choice whether we're going to spend our lives trying to amass enough stuff so we can have goods laid up so that when we are old we can take it easy and eat and drink and be merry. What I just said to you is the American dream, isn't it? Isn't that the American dream? That you work until you're in your mid-50s or late 50s, and then you have amassed enough that you can stay at the same level of ease and comfort, and you can travel, and you can eat out, and you can play sports and golf and do everything you want to do without having to work. That is all this man wanted to do. Have you ever thought of that? That is what every American seems to want to do. Think about it. Think about, do you have primarily financial goals for the future? If you're normal in America, you do. It is something we all have to face. And what this man did, he was rolling his dice, and he left God out of his thoughts. He thought within himself, verse 17, he never consulted the Lord. He left God out of his plans. It says, I'm going to build my barns. And verse 19, he left God out of his future. And the Lord says, you put all your chips in the wrong corner and you lost the roll of the dice. And you did not choose to be rich toward me. Pilate, we don't relate to. This guy is American. I mean, he could run a seminar, talk about how to build bigger barns. Well, let's go back to chapter 15 and let's finish up on Pilate. Because Pilate, as you know the story, if we went all the way down to verse 21, his wife tells him it's bad, and so finally you remember the monumental scene of him washing his hands of the matter? That's gone into, I'm washing my hands of the matter. It's so interesting how many of these things come from the Scriptures. Feet of clay from Daniel, handwriting on the wall from Daniel. Your numbers up. Remember when they called the numbers and everyone bowed down? The 3 Hebrew children didn't. Face the music. That's from Daniel too. Well, this, when they didn't bow at the music, they were put in the furnace. This is where we get wash your hands of the matter. And what's fascinating, and I'll just end with this, Pilate stayed till 36. He stayed 6 years after the crucifixion. Always a suspect. Always not quite right with the government in Rome. And finally, they removed from him his governorship and banished him to what we would call today Switzerland area. He was put on the outskirts of the empire and banished up to where the barbarians lived, the Germans. They were the barbarians of the day, always attacking the Romans. And they put him right on the border. And let me just read to you from, if you go up to Switzerland around Lake Lucerne and go from Italy into the Alps, into Switzerland, this is what, if you go up there, you'll read the legend of Pilate. And this is just so interesting. Even the legends have him. Legend tells us if you were to wind your way through the Alps into Italy, into Switzerland, there's a nearly inaccessible pool of icy water ringed by snow-capped mountains. And if you can find it, there's a narrow snake path that goes down to the frigid shore of a glacial lake. And there, early in the morning and late at night, you can see an aged, gray-haired man clad only in a purple toga of Rome, bent over, desperately scrubbing his hands in the ice-cold, crystal-clear waters, mumbling over and over again, I am innocent. I am innocent of the blood of this man. Although we know that's not true. Their legend reminds us that Pilate hitched his wagon to the wrong meteor going up. Pilate put all of his chips in the wrong corner. Or you might put it this way, he was waiting for the wrong bus. He got on the wrong bus. He should have gone with Christ, but he didn't. He went with the crowd. He should have gone with truth, but he didn't. He went with expedience and the moment and protecting his own interests. And he left behind the greatest opportunity he had. He was the only person that Jesus spoke to face, eye to eye, and shared truth with in that whole time. Pilate missed out. He didn't know it. But if you read on through verse 21, where we'll pick up next time, he missed his last opportunity. Here's a verse I want to close with. Look at Luke 18 and verse 37. Because every time I read through the Pilate story, I always think of the happy ending that it could have been. Luke 18 and verse 37 is the story of the 2 blind men in Jericho, if you remember the story, and they were crying out. Look at what it says. I'll start in verse 35. Then it happened, as he, Jesus, was coming near Jericho, a certain blind man sat by the road begging. And he heard a multitude passing by, and he asked what it meant. Now listen to verse 37, one of the most beautiful verses of the Gospels. So they told him that Jesus of Nazareth was passing by. Now imagine, this guy's sitting, blind, unable to get out. The other accounts say there are 2. There probably were. He was just the vocal one. And here they were, and he was sitting by the roadside, and this moment was coming, and Jesus was passing by, and he didn't see him. He couldn't get to him. So what did he do? Jesus was coming by. Remember the story? Verse 39 or verse 38. So he cried out saying, Jesus, Son of David. And he didn't know where he was. He was blind. He was listening. He was sitting there by the roadside listening. His ears were so acute because of his blindness. And he could hear the crowd, and he could hear it getting louder, and he could hear the voices. And finally, when he thought he'd reached the crescendo, from the side of the road, he screamed out for all he's worth, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. That reminds me of how people get saved. You have the Pilates, and Jesus stands right in front of them. And they go, not today. Not today. It costs me too much. It embarrasses me. I might have to change my life. I might have to... And he missed. Pilate missed his last opportunity. As far as we know, he was hardened, according to all legends, except for one church that has made him a saint. Other than that one legend, which is no grounds for it, Pilate goes into history lost, denying Christ. But blind Bartimaeus wasn't married to Claudia Procula, wasn't related to Augustus or Tiberius, was not a governor and didn't have a wife, was sitting over there, and he heard Jesus was coming near, and he knew and had heard, like Pilate had, that Jesus had great power. And he says, I want Jesus. I wonder tonight, are you like Pilate? Are you betting everything, putting it all in the wrong place? Or when you hear that there's an opportunity to place your life and your hope and your future and your direction and your treasures and your time and everything else, that you say, Jesus, look what happens. So Jesus stood still. By the way, they tell him to be quiet in verse 39, and he cried out all the more. He was persistent. And Jesus stood still and commanded for him to be brought. And when he'd come, he asked him, what do you want me to do? And he said, Lord, may I receive my sight? And Jesus said, receive your sight. Your faith has made you well. And immediately he received his sight and followed him, glorifying God. And everybody was blessed. You're going to be like Pilate? Let your chance go by. You're going to be like this blind man and cry out to him. And if you're a believer, there's a message too. Don't build your barns too big, but give them to Jesus like that blind man did. Let's all think about that as we stand together, and we're going to be closed in a word of prayer and ask the Lord to help us to make sure that we have the right goal in life, because Pilate certainly didn't. Let's bow together. Father in heaven, I thank you for the pictures of your word. They're so vivid. Pilate was planning for having it all. He married right, he picked the right friends, he knew the ropes, and he lost it all. You graced him with the only face-to-face moments of that passion and your suffering. And he followed the crowd, and he missed his opportunity, and he made the wrong choice. And I pray that tonight, thinking of Pilate and thinking of Jesus passing by him, that we would in our heart of hearts say, Jesus, don't pass by me. I cry out to you, if for the first time, for the forgiveness of my sins. And if as a believer I cry out to you and say, Lord, I include you in my plans for the future. I don't want to build my barn so big that I leave you out and I'm not rich toward you. It'd be better to die poor but rich in heaven than having full barns and not be rich toward you, O God. You warned us. And we who are so tempted with the American dream, may we evaluate what on earth we're living for and not miss the bus like Pilate did. We'll thank you for how you apply your word to our hearts as we bow before you and humbly ask you to have your own way, Lord, in our lives. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.